Good day, everyone. Thank you for joining our Include NYC Live. My name is Mia Greenidge. I'm Manager for Youth and Transition Services here at Include. Include NYC is the leading provider of training and information for young people with disabilities from birth to age 26 in New York City, their families, and the professionals who support them. For this presentation, we have with us the Honorable Kristen Booth Glenn, who is here today to discuss supported decision-making, and more specifically, the progress from the last 4 years of the Supported Decision-Making New York, also referred to as SDMNY. This is one of a series of live stream presentations that are aired the third Thursday of the month. There is a chat box for you to enter questions, and we aim to be able to answer your questions either during or at the end of our 60-minute presentation. So a little background on our guest here. Kristen has had a long and productive career as an educator and judge. From 2005 to 2012, she served as surrogate judge of New York County, where she had jurisdiction over guardianship of persons with intellectual and developmental disabilities. Most recently, after mandatory retirement, she returned to CUNY as university professor and dean emerita, where in her capacity, she was able to be a part of building the Supported Decision-Making New York project. Welcome, Kristen. We are honored to have you with us today.
Thank you so much.
Before we dive right into the Supported Decision-Making New York project and the progress over the last 4 years and how one can get involved, I was hoping that we can start our viewers off, for some who may not be familiar with the project or with supported decision-making as an alternative to guardianship. If we can just start off, since you've been so progressively involved and have the grant for the project, how did the project get started?
So I'm really happy to answer that question, but I have been cautioned and urged by our project coordinator to begin by mentioning that our grant, which we'll talk about more later, runs out in 2021 at the end of March. So we have a little more than a year left. So if anybody watching this webinar today is interested, if this piques your curiosity, if you think you might want to be involved, now's the time to act. Get in touch with us because we're free. That's like a big part of it.
Right.
And we'll be around for a little more over than a year. So now's the time.
Great. So I'm glad we're having this conversation now.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Thanks so much. So back to your question, which was,
how did the project get started?
Well, there's been work going on around supported decision-making all over the world since 2008, when the United Nations Convention on the Rights of People with Disabilities went into effect. So this is something that's happening everywhere. It didn't really catch on in the United States until about 2012, when people first started talking about it. And then by 2015, the DDPC, the Developmental Disabilities Planning Council in New York, got very interested in the idea of supported decision-making as an alternative to guardianship. And so they put out a request for proposals for a 5-year project, funded project, to test SDM. And I'll say SDM instead of supported decision-making just to save time, right? Because we have limited time here. And a consortium of which I am a member got together, put in a proposal for the grant, and then we started in March of 2016.
That is so awesome. Okay. And so for some
we thought so at the time.
I know. Still awesome. For some of our viewers or some individuals who are not clear on guardianship, do you think you can give us a little bit more?
Sure. I know a lot about this because as a judge, both for adult guardianship and then as surrogate for guardianship for people with intellectual and developmental disabilities. And just quickly, that's called Article 17A. So many of your viewers may have heard of it as that. Guardianship is the process by which the law, the state, takes away from a person the ability to make every decision in his life or her life. So if someone is placed under 17A guardianship, they lose all of their rights, their right to decide where to live, who to live with, whether to work, what kind of educational opportunities, whether to marry, whether to vote. All of that is taken away. There's no kind of whole shebang. And I think one of the things that's been really interesting to us in this project is learning from parents at information sessions and then at an evaluation that we had done, that many, many parents apply for guardianship without really understanding that that's what's at stake.
Right.
They're just told you should do it. It's the thing you need to do when your child turns 18. It's the thing that will keep your child safe, without understanding that it deprives that person of all of his or her rights forever.
Right. And so how did you get involved in guardianship, and what has been your...
So as I say, I have experience as a judge sitting in the Supreme Court before I went to CUNY to be dean, in which I heard guardianships and actually was involved in that guardianship law for adults. And that's a different law. That's called Article 81.
Right.
And then when I became surrogate in 2005, I started having these hearings for people with intellectual and developmental disabilities. And I was, first of all, horrified by the idea that it was really up and down, black and white, binary, that either you kept all your rights or you lost all your rights. That seemed really wrong to me based on the work that I'd done with adult guardianship. But also I saw, a lot of people for whom guardianship was sought who it didn't seem to me needed to have all their rights taken away, or indeed any of their rights taken away, and who seemed to me to be able, or who would be able with supports, to be able to make their own decisions. And the statute that exists now really only requires a diagnosis. So one of the things that's so strange about this is that this statute was passed in 1969.
Wow.
And I think in 1969, sort of everybody with an intellectual and developmental disability was lumped into one pot. They are eternal children, they will never grow up, they always need parental guidance. And now we understand that it's a huge spectrum of people with all kinds of abilities, some impairments, different kinds of abilities. There are certainly people with IDD who, are smarter in many ways than I am.
Right.
Sometimes it's a matter just of the ability to communicate because of cerebral palsy or something else. So this sort of one size fits all just really is not appropriate any longer. And I think that's what started to lead me towards thinking about what are alternatives at the same time that this international movement towards supported decision-making was taking off.
That's so interesting. And so as an alternative, there is the supported decision-making process. And for some people who aren't very clear on that, can you go into detail about that?
Sure. So first, let me say about supported decision-making that while we're talking about it for people with IDD, it's something we all do. Nobody, if you think about it, there's probably no major and lots of minor decisions that you have ever made without consulting or getting support from other people, whether you talk to friends or family, whether you consult experts, whether you hire an accountant to do your taxes, whether you and I talked about what colors we were going to wear today.
Right.
Everybody uses supports. And people with intellectual and developmental disabilities use supports also, but in order to make their decisions, they might need more supports or different kinds of supports or more intense supports. But it's a process that we all engage in. It's nothing special for people with IDD. So the question really is, with regard to each individual, what areas does he or she need support in, want support in? People might be perfectly competent to decide lots of things about their social lives, about their educational lives, but really get stuck when it comes to medical issues. That's actually true for lots of us too, right? So the kinds of support that we are talking about, and again, you can reflect on whether you use them as well, or the audience, whether you use them, are getting information about the decision to be made, collecting information. So for a medical decision, that would be like, what are what are different choices? What are different treatment options? What are different meds?
Right.
Then understanding that information, having it spelled out for you. And again, you might have a friend who is a nurse who could explain it to you, et cetera. Weighing the consequences, thinking about what alternatives are. Well, if I make this decision, are there other choices? What might they be? And then weighing the alternatives. What might happen? And the consequences, what might happen if I decide this, or if I don't decide this? And then, particularly for people who don't communicate in traditional ways, communicating the decision to third parties. And finally, support in implementing the decision.
Right.
So we call those part of the big four. what areas people want support in, what kinds of support they want of those 5, and sometimes there are more, who they want that support from, who are always trusted people in their lives, and then how they want to get the support. And that's the process of supported decision making. And it can be quite informal. I mean, there are many, many, many more people with intellectual and developmental disabilities in New York State who are out there in the world without guardianship, who are getting informal support and doing fine.
Right.
Many more than there are under guardianship. But there's also this more formalized process that we are engaged in, which is largely because third parties, healthcare professionals who need informed consent, banks, landlords, et cetera, all live in a world in which everybody worries about legal liability. And so in many instances where they have reason to doubt the quote unquote capacity of a person with IDD, they may refuse to accept decisions because they're afraid they'll get sued. And so they'll say, you know, I'd love to let you take money out of your bank account, but I'm really afraid that if I do, somebody will come back and sue me. So you just better get a guardian and I'll deal with the guardian. Or the doctor says, I don't know if you're capable of giving informed consent. So I want you, the parent, to become a guardian. Right. So that I know I won't get sued. So that's the reason I think that we've really moved towards this interest in formalized supported decision making, which we can talk about in a minute.
Right.
And also because in a more formal way, it's more obviously an alternative to guardianship that could keep parents from petitioning in the first place, or where people are already under guardianship could persuade judges that it's no longer necessary, that there's a better, less restrictive way for people to be in the world without having their rights taken away.
I think that's really helpful for our audience because it clarifies, as you said, you gave a background on guardianship for us, but then this also introduces something that for those who may be watching or those who support people with this type of decision making and understanding, expanding the thought that there is an alternative to guardianship. It's not the only way you can go.
Absolutely.
And it's more of an in-depth process that allows the person to feel truly supported and be able to make the same decisions that you and I would make in our lives with support, like you said.
Well, and also, and this is always a kind of tricky thing and a little hard for parents, and also to make some bad decisions. Because, again, I would ask anyone who is watching or you, is it possible that you've never made a bad decision?
No, you're right. I mean,
and hopefully you learn from it, right? I mean, that's how we all learn it from touching the stove and never doing it again, right?
Right.
So I think a really important issue for parents that we've seen in this process is one of the reasons that parents, I think, rush into guardianship is because they're very concerned about what's going to happen when they get older and are no longer able to take care of their kids.
Right.
And somehow they think that if there's guardianship, it's all going to be okay. That's not necessarily the case. I mean, first of all, the idea, when the young adult is 20 years old and the parent is 45, that if anything happens, the sibling will take over is fine. But 20 years later, when the parent can no longer take care of the child, the young adult, then the sibling may be, living in California and maybe a single mom with 3 kids and can't take it on or doesn't want to take it on or isn't around or whatever. So the idea that somehow in the future guardianship is going to protect is not necessarily true. And in that period of time, in those 20 years, if the young adult who is now 40 years old has never had to make decisions, has never learned from making bad decisions, does not have a formalized support network around him or her, the chances are that he or she may end up in an institution. So really the best way, and I think that this really resonates with the parents that we talk to a lot, of ensuring that your child will have self-determination and inclusion in their lives and live good lives for their whole lives, is to develop these decision-making skills and the willingness to use support and a support network. Optimally, it would start when they're in pre-K, right? But we're getting them when they're 18, 19, 20.
Right.
Or 60. I mean, we have people in this project who are much older as well, but I think that the big audience and your big audience is young adults in transition.
Right. That's usually when this, panic or when this thought process really drives home for us, is when we're thinking about, our young people hitting that transition period and what that looks like and how do we support them.
Well, and it's just pervasive.
Yeah.
The evaluation that we had done showed us in ways that echoed what we were seeing on the ground, but in a more scientifically validating way, that there are just a whole series of forces that push parents. There's the schools, there's the healthcare professionals, there's other parents. It's hardwired into your child turns 18, get guardianship. Without ever understanding really what the consequences of that are.
That's all really great. And it's a good segue for us to now dig into more about what is SDMNY, right? Which is Supported Decision Making New York. So let's dig into what is the project?
So the grant that we have from DDPC requires us to do two different things. One is to educate people about supported decision making. So thank you for having me on the second time.
We're getting started now.
We're getting started. And the second is to run two pilot projects in which we utilize supported decision making. In the first one, which is called the Diversion Project, to divert often young adults, not always young adults, who are at risk of guardianship from being placed under guardianship. And then the second, which actually operates exactly the same way, is the Restoration Project. And that's for people who are already under guardianship, using supported decision making to demonstrate to their guardian and to the court that they are now able to make their own decisions with support from trusted people in their lives, and that guardianship should be terminated and that their rights should be restored. So what we started off having to do was literally to develop a process of what we call facilitation for people with IDD, who we call the decision maker, because we wanted to be really clear that they are at the center of this process, and it's their process. It's not something that's being imposed on them, like the IEP meetings or other things that happen within the agency and service provision context. Not that there's anything wrong with them, but this is about you, and this is what you want, and let's see if we can make it happen for you.
Okay. And how long has the project been running?
The project began in 2016. We spent the first year basically developing the model. We are, I should say that it's a collaboration of Hunter College and City University of New York. I assume people know what that is. And the New York State Alliance for Innovation and Inclusion, which is a statewide association of provider agencies, and then ARC of Westchester, which is a large provider agency. So we spent the first year developing this model, and so we had a lot of academic input. We were able to look at things like intrinsic motivation theory, how do we get people to really want to do this, decision-making theory, what goes into making a decision, and so forth. And also to draw on the experience of these pilots all over the world, in Europe, in Africa, and particularly in Australia, where there had been a large number of them that were sponsored in different states. Australia is like the US, it's a federal government, so there are states. So we had all of that, but we also had a charge to develop something that would serve the entire population of New York, which is unbelievably diverse in every way you can imagine, racially, economically, city, suburb, rural, immigration status, documented, undocumented. So it was a much bigger challenge and a much larger kind of potential client base than anybody else had worked with. And so we actually began to do that in the second year, and it is, as I say, a facilitation process. It depends on volunteer facilitators who we also had to recruit and train. We sort of tried it out for the second year in New York, and then moved towards Westchester towards the end of that year. And then in the middle of year 3, with our partner, the New York Alliance, we moved out into 3 additional sites. So we're now also in Rochester / Western New York, which I've recently learned, since we actually got a decision maker in Chautauqua, that they have facilitators up there in Chautauqua. So there's Rochester, Western New York, there's the Capital Region, which is around Albany, and then there is Long Island, which is Nassau and Suffolk. And those projects are all up and running. So if anyone who's watching lives anywhere near, especially in the Western New York area, there is an SDMNY site that you can connect with and get involved in the program.
And as you mentioned, the grant has a certain period. So is there a time pressure right now? I know you mentioned earlier on that it's now is the time.
Right.
So,
right.
Right.
So the grant runs out on March 31st of 2021. You can see that number is engraved in my brain.
Right.
We are obviously very hopeful that because we have been so successful, that the state will pick this up and do it for everybody. But we're only around until the end of March in 2021. So one of the things that we've learned in this pilot, in which we've been able to fine tune over the last 3 years, is that it takes longer than we thought.
Right.
Based on what was going on in other countries, we thought 6 to 9 months. It's really more like 9 to 12 months. So again, for people who think that this might be of interest to them, there'll be obviously a gap between getting in touch with us, having a meeting.
Right.
We will do one-on-one meetings with people to talk about it for them and for their adult child, and for the young people with intellectual and developmental disabilities who are watching. This is your process. You can start this. This is really about you. And let me tell you, we don't do it unless you want to do it.
Right.
We sign up the decision maker, and then we get a consent from the parent, unless the decision maker is under 18, at which point we get an assent from the decision maker and a consent from the parent.
Okay.
Same thing with people who are under guardianship. And I should say also that when we talk about the restoration project, a lot of parents that we've met did what they were told to do. They got guardianship, and either because they came to an information session or because something happened in the young person's life, they began to realize what they had done and that it was really, at the very least, overkill. So there are a lot of those parents around who say, I did what I thought was best, and they did, but now I see that there's another way. So I would like to have my child involved. My adult child wants to be involved, wants to do this, and get his or her rights back.
And I think that's an important piece too. Just thinking about, for those who've already engaged in the guardianship process, if they wanted to explore this as an alternative, that they can.
Yes,
that it's still an option for them.
Absolutely. I mean, we've gotten people who were just thinking about it. We've gotten people who had started the process and then stopped it and said, I'm going to give this a chance. We are actually getting referrals from judges now who are seeing young people who say, I don't really think that this is right. Why don't you go talk to SDMNY? That's pretty great.
Yeah.
And then we have either people who are under guardianship who are really functioning in the world and don't feel like they need their legal rights taken away, or younger adults and their parents who say, we did this, but we think now that there is a better choice. And I want to be really clear. Parents who did it, they didn't do a bad thing.
Right.
They did what they were told was the best thing, but now there really is a better thing.
Right. And sometimes it just takes knowing what the full options are. And with a topic like this, sometimes you don't always.
And that's why we're really grateful to you for having me on.
I'm excited. How excited I am. I keep expressing how excited I am. So we know now's the time to get involved. How does the process actually work?
So let's say that you're a parent and his or her adult child watching this, and you think, this would be interesting. You call or email the site coordinator at any of the 5 sites. Okay. And you have that information, I think, went out with.
Yes, it's in the contact package.
It's in the contact package. And they will set up a one-on-one or one-on-two or whatever meeting with you, in which they'll talk to the prospective decision maker and the parent or whoever else is involved. And then either the prospective decision maker will say, yes, I'd like to do this. So let's assume that's what happens.
Let's assume, yeah.
They sign up, and then they are matched with a trained facilitator. And then the 3-phase facilitation process begins.
Okay.
So in the first phase, the facilitator meets only with the decision maker. not with parents,
Mhm.
because this is the decision maker's process, only with the decision maker to get to know him or her. I'm going to say her from now on, if that's okay, to get to know her and what kinds of decisions she's making now, what kinds of decisions she might need to make in the future,
Mhm.
how she makes decisions, who the important people in her life are, and so forth. And then starts to explore those issues of what areas, do you want help in? Is it about healthcare? Is it about finances? Those seem to be the two big ones. Is it about support services? Is it about personal relationships?
Mhm.
Dare I say, sex and intimacy?
Mhm.
And what kinds of supports would you want? And one of the things that we've really learned over the course of the last 3 years is that most people, including decision makers, don't really break down what goes into making a decision. And so that's where the discussion about what are the elements of making a decision, getting the information, understanding the information, weighing options, considering alternatives. So there's a lot of discussion about that. And then really an exploration of who are the trusted people in your life who you would want support from. And the supporters, there's no limit on the number of supporters that a decision maker can choose.
Mhm.
There can be more than one supporter in a particular area. So, you might want mom and your sister on health and dad on finances, and maybe because you really don't want to talk about intimacy and dating in your family, a teacher from school or an aunt or a cousin or
Right.
a friend or someone. So the most supporters that any of our decision makers have chosen is 11.
Wow.
We feel very strongly that there need to be more than one.
Mhm.
And that's part of what answers the question about why is this safe? What about under
Right.
influence? I mean, we think that when there's a group of people who are committed to providing support, that if anything sort of starts going wrong or going south, there'll be people to see it and who can intervene
Right.
and call for something to happen. So we're opposed to one supporter, although if that's all there is, for now,
Mhm.
that's all there is. I should also say, and we'll get to the supported decision-making agreement, but the decision about who you want as supporters now is not binding forever.
Mhm.
The decision maker always has the right to fire a supporter,
Mhm.
add supporters, change areas, et cetera. So
Mhm.
it's a very flexible process that gets ultimately recorded and formalized in the formal agreement. So that's the first phase.
Okay.
The second phase is the supporters are invited in, and the decision maker can be there or not, as he or she chooses. And what we see as important there is both educating the supporters about supported decision making. So if someone who's watching is chosen as a supporter, and probably they will be because we see that family members almost always are, they will have heard this and they will have had the one-on-one interview. But
Right.
even so, they may still have questions. And the school basketball coach and the sibling and the next door neighbor aren't
Mhm.
going to have the vaguest idea. So
Right.
there's an educational piece. And then what we call repositioning.
Mhm.
And this is moving people from the relationship that they have with the decision maker now, which is loving, but I know best
Mhm.
and I will decide, to I recognize you as an autonomous human being.
Mhm.
I will support you in your decisions and I will respect your right to do that. And I always say, particularly to parents who also have neurotypical kids, I mean, we go through this all the time.
Mhm.
With our neurotypical kids, we often go through it with a lot of kicking and screaming
Mhm.
before you make that transition from, you don't know anything to, oh my God, you're 30 years old and, you've chosen a profession and a spouse and you have kids of your own. I guess,
Right.
I guess it's time for me to start saying, yeah, you really do know how.
Right.
So that's what goes on in phase 2.
Okay.
And each of these phases takes as long as it needs to take to get what needs to be done.
Mhm.
And then when the supporters get it and have bought in, we move to phase 3, which, because I'm a lawyer, I call negotiating the contract. And
Okay.
that's where everybody sits down together, the decision makers and the supporters. They go back to the big 4, the what areas, the what kinds of support, the who, and they literally negotiate a contract, a written contract that says, mom will support me in healthcare decisions by bringing me information and helping me understand it, but I don't want her to help me weigh the alternatives, because I know that once she expresses a preference, I'll just want to do what she wants to do. So I'd like my sister to help me, to give the support of helping me with weighing the alternatives and so forth. And that's all written out as a contract. And usually it goes through a couple of drafts. Sometimes in phase 3, completely new information comes in. There might be an area that the decision maker hadn't thought about and now maybe wants to consider. There might be somebody who he or she hadn't thought about as a supporter, but who might be great. And then we sort of start phase 2 over for that person. So it's very flexible. The facilitator works through a draft, sends it to the site coordinator, who then sends it to our project coordinator and me. We're both lawyers. And we go over and make suggestions, and then the facilitator brings it back to the party. This is just, I mean, this is like any other contract, really. And they look at it again, and maybe there's something else they want to tweak or change. And then finally, when everybody's in agreement, the agreement is signed. And so far for us, those signings have been really joyous occasions. And where we have gotten a number of decision makers from one place, like there's a school where our very first 3 decision makers all came from that school. So we did a ceremony there. And the headmaster came, and the principal of the upper school came, and a bunch of their friends came. It was really lovely. We did one with self-advocates at Saney's in New York that the commissioner of the mayor's office of people with disabilities came to and spoke at. We've just done our first one in Rochester, which was quite wonderful. They're always really joyous because they celebrate the success of a process. And I think if there's one thing I could say about this, supported decision making and what we're doing is not about the piece of paper. It's about the process that people with intellectual and developmental disabilities and their supporters learn to use for that person to make decisions for the rest of his or her life. And as I say, it can be changed. There can be areas in which a person over time develops enough capabilities that they don't need support anymore. Or there can be new areas like, oh, I'm getting married, I'm thinking about having a baby, I really need some support about that. So it's flexible, but it is a process. It's not just a piece of paper.
And so I like the fact that it's a process. I like that it's very detailed and layered as far as the specifics of who the supporter is, the decisions as they get down to it. Like you said, I want my mom to bring me all the healthcare information, but I want my sister to help with the decision because I favor mom's opinion. So I love that. I
favor her. I just don't want her to feel bad.
So
I want her to be happy. I want her to love me.
And it's really good to hear like how detailed it can go. And thinking of who is supporting the decision maker through the process, the facilitators, can we learn more about who they are and
Sure.
as part of this process?
Sure. So again, part of our charge under the grant was to develop a process and to develop pilots that would be sustainable. Which means basically they couldn't cost a whole lot of, that if we were to expand this, it can't cost a fortune, right? So we were focused on getting volunteer facilitators from the beginning, and we thought about all kinds of different groups of people who might be willing to volunteer and take this on and do it for free. And I might say, in case we run out of time, that it's really rewarding and our facilitators love doing it. So if any of you are interested in being facilitators, please contact us about that as well. We do a 2-day training, and then every facilitator is matched with a mentor who's an experienced facilitator, and they check in for every meeting. I should say also, those meetings tend to happen about once a month, partly just because of people's lives, partly because it takes a while for people to process information. So for facilitators, it's about a 2.5 hour a month commitment. So think about it. What we have learned is that pure volunteers are harder to utilize because things come up in their lives and then they can't continue. And we'd obviously like people to have a seamless experience. So we've concentrated a lot on both people who already work for service provider agencies who are doing it as volunteers on their own time, but also on students in graduate professional programs as part of their field work. So social work students, MSW students, BSW students, occupational therapy assistant students. We love them. They're really great. And we're now into our third group of 6 of them. They've been really successful. We've just started now with graduate students in education who want to specialize in special education. So this is really an opportunity for them also to work one-on-one with a person with intellectual disability and see them grow, as opposed to just a classroom setting, which is their ordinary field work and placement. So most people who are facilitators bring a background. We also have parents. Obviously, no one is facilitating their own child, but we have parents who really believe in this, and we even have some parents now of young adults who have gone through, and they are so pleased with the way the process went that they want to share it with others.
That's pretty amazing.
But there is constant supervision and guidance. I mean, I want to make that clear, and I think that's very important to the integrity of the process.
Right. Okay. And so we touched a little bit on the decision makers as they're involved in the process, but I think I want to just go back to touching on that a little bit more in depth about how it's centered around them, right?
Yeah, and this is another one of the real learnings for us. I think we were surprised when we first started working, particularly with the young transition age decision makers, that they didn't think of themselves as decision makers at all. I mean, when you asked, what kind of decisions are you making? They'd say, no, I don't make decisions. And you'd have to really ask questions like, well, I see that you're wearing a really nice shirt today. Like, who chose that shirt, right? And then you can ask the questions like, well, did you have alternatives? Did you think about that shirt versus another shirt? Did you think what the weather might be today and so forth? So to really break down what decision making is, and we see over the course of the process, people moving from to I am the decision maker. And I know one of the facilitators told me about the first meeting of phase 3 with a decision maker who had been very, very quiet, very reluctant in the beginning, and who by the time she got to that phase walked in, sat at the head of the table, told people where to sit, her supporters where to sit, and said, this is my meeting, and now we're going to negotiate our supported decision-making agreement. So what we see in this process is an unbelievable transformation. I was at a signing a couple of weeks ago, and the mother said, he never thought about himself. He never thought about himself before, and now he thinks all the time about what he does. And guardianship, there's no thinking, and that's why we did this. So I'd also really encourage people. I know we sent a link of a parent. We couldn't figure out a way to put it into the session because of the technology. It's not fancy. We don't have any money in our budget for fancy videographers or making amazing, commercial looking things. This is just a conversation that we had with a mom, literally over the phone and taking it. But she really talks about that process for her son as well. And it is absolutely transformational for everyone who goes into it.
Right. For
the decision maker, who really comes out a more confident person who understands what decisions are, who understands what goes into making them, and who understands where he or she needs support to do that. The supporters, all talk about how it's really changed their relationship with the decision maker, and the facilitators, feel like, wow, I really helped change someone's life here.
Right. So it's just a rewarding experience overall.
It is.
For all parties involved. That's really great to hear. In thinking about the SDMA, right? What is the SDMA, and is it
legal?
Is it legal?
Right.
Why is it important and legal?
Right. So the SDMA is the agreement,
right?
That after the draft and whatever gets signed, and it's a piece of paper, and the decision maker has it, and the supporters have it. I should say the supporters also, swear that or affirm that they're going to support the decision maker and not make decisions for him or her, so forth, and sign it. Right now, it is something that third parties can honor, and it says right in it, the decision maker says, I would like third parties to understand that this is how I make decisions and to honor them. But it is not legally binding. It's not now like a power of attorney. It is in 8 states and the District of Columbia. Again, as I say, this came to the US fairly late. The first statute was in 2015. We got 3 new ones last year. And they're in a funny group of states. That actually Texas was the first state. I think in Rhode Island was the most recent. And all of those statutes provide that third parties, that doctors, that bankers, that landlords must accept decisions made by people who, a person with CP who doesn't speak in a way that's really clear, who's in a chair, and the banker or the doctor says, I don't really know if they've got a supported decision making where there's legislation. That's the end of it. They have to accept that decision. So that's what we need in New York. And one of the reasons that DDPC gave us this grant was to show that it works, so that we could get that legislation.
Right.
And we will really be beginning, I think, in the fall of this year to be we're going to start now to begin educating legislators about what we have done, what we have learned, and why this is a good thing. But until there's a law, it's not legally binding.
Right.
Third parties can accept it. We don't have enough experience yet because we only had our first decision makers signing SDMAs, I guess, just about a year ago. So we don't have a whole lot of experience about how it's going down. But hopefully within a year or two, we'll have the legislation, and then it will be legal.
So it's another reason why right now is the time to get active in this project, because
well, and you're a pioneer too.
Right. Yeah. You're a pioneer in helping hopefully get towards the legislation.
Yeah.
So moving forward and thinking about the project and how it's been placed for the last 4 years, what are some of the lessons learned? Like, what are some of the big takeaways?
Well, for us, one takeaway that I've already mentioned is how little parents and others who petition for guardianship really understand what the consequences are. The biggest takeaway, obviously, for us, and I don't think I've said this clearly enough, is that it works. We walked into it thinking that it would, although how our process, which is different in some ways relating to the different population that we're serving, is different from the populations other people have worked with. It really works. And I guess beyond it working, it's how transformational it is. That everybody in this process is different at the end than they were at the beginning, and different in a really good way. I think that we've done a lot of fine tuning along the way. I think our facilitator training has become much more sophisticated. We have a 100-page manual so that people have really a document that they can, look at. We've understood the role of the mentor to be really, really important. And I think another thing that came up a lot in the beginning that we've learned is that people with IDD and their parents and others around them are really used to a service provision system where everybody talks about goals. The IEP, what's the goal here? What's the goal? But they're goals in which other people are making decisions about how the person reaches their goals. And people often ask us, what's the difference between person-centered planning and a supported decision-making or supported decision-making agreement? One is that the person-centered planning all happens in the context of an agency. And decisions that are made around service provision, whereas supported decision-making is about every decision you make in the rest of your life. But it's also about the many decisions that people have to make in order to get to goals. We can't say, you want to start your own bank account, or you want to move into your own apartment, and what we're doing in supported decision-making is going to help you get into your apartment. But we're going to give you the tools to make the many decisions that would be necessary. What would it cost? What would be a safe neighborhood? How would you save the money? What would happen if something went wrong? What is a lease? What kinds of support do you need, and from whom, to help you get through this process, if this is what you want to do? So we're all kind of, there's a phrase that the person who invented all this training in Australia uses, which is rescuers. Like, if there's an issue, we're always in there to save the day, right? And to fix things. And we really need to move away from that. We need to move away from what we call goal speak, which is getting to the goal, in which it's often easier for us to just do it for the young person than to have the young person do it him or herself. So getting away from goal speak, not being rescuers, and really focusing on decisions.
And have there been any changes that you guys have put in place since you've been for the past 4 years to really hammer in
Well, I think both our facilitator training and therefore what the facilitators are doing has become increasingly sophisticated as we've understood the need to really break down what goes into making a decision and modeling for decision makers how they're doing that in every decision they make. For example, when we ask them, who do you want to be your supporters? Then you can ask the questions, well, what are the choices? What kind of information would you want to, you say you love your bus driver, on your bus, and you really like him. Would you want to know if he knows anything about whatever area it is that you want support in? Might you want to ask other people who might be useful to do that? Are there other choices? If you ask the bus driver and then you get another bus driver, what might that mean? So all of the aspects of making decisions, from getting the information, understanding the information, thinking about alternatives, weighing the consequences, modeling that every time somebody makes a decision so that it really becomes a conscious process. And a process in which they understand where they need support and how they get it and how they use it.
It's really great.
Yeah, it's pretty exciting.
It's pretty exciting. And so what are some of the other benefits of the program?
Well, I think for everybody, the decision makers really come out more self-determined. I think the parents or whoever it is who might have petitioned for guardianship or the existing guardians come out with a lot more confidence that this really is a way that their loved one can be in the world and can be successful in the world. I guess another takeaway, as I said, was that it takes longer than we thought.
Right.
So it is a serious process. People do have to be willing to commit. I should also say, if it's not working, people can leave. People have dropped out. Supporters, chosen supporters have said, I can't do this. I just want to stay in my role as mom.
Right.
So there's room for change. But I think primarily that it is a process and that it is a process which itself benefits the decision maker. And what I always say to parents is, and my children are quite old now, and I have grandchildren who are in their teens and their early 20s. But I say, wouldn't it be nice if you'd actually been able to go through this very same process with your neurotypical kids? Like say, okay, I understand that you want to make your own decisions, but there are some things that I know how to do that you don't yet. What if we could agree on the areas where you would agree that I can support you, and then others in which you just want to make the decisions on your own? Wouldn't that have been better than the tantrums and the screaming and the sneaking out at night and whatever else we all went through with our kids? So I think it's really beneficial for parents as well. And again, especially with regard to thinking about the future. Knowing that between today and the time, which none of us want to think about when I won't be around anymore, that my loved one has really learned and grown in self-determination, in the ability to make decisions, in understanding when he or she needs support, and perhaps most of all, in having a flexible circle of support around him of people who are really committed to supporting and making decisions. So that, much as I don't like to think about myself as not being there to always do it, I know it's going to be okay.
Right. This is all great. I've been taking my little notes on the side for myself. This is all great information for our decision makers, their families, and even the professionals, right? Those of us that are working with these families and working with these young people. I know me in particular, there's a lot of little touches that I even wrote for myself. So,
and we love referrals,
Right.
But again, remember, it's not, you are sending this person to be part of our program. You are sending this person to talk to us about whether he or she wants to be part of the program.
And I love that piece because that's the one piece that you want to hammer in, is that this is now the time for the young person to start thinking about what they want for their lives and themselves.
And that's why we call them the decision makers.
So for more information, like if we're seeking more information, if we want to know more, we're thinking about how we can get started and get involved, what does that look like and what do we need to know?
Sure. Well, for starters, I've said that if you're interested in the project, that you can reach out to the sites. But all of this is available through our website. which is SDMNY.org. But if you just Google Supported Decision Making New York, you'll get us. There's a lot of information on that site. There's scholarly articles. There's an evaluation of our project. There's some wonderful, really wonderful, actually quite funny videos about decision making that were made by a theater group that we work with of people with intellectual disabilities themselves.
Really?
Yeah, they're really great. They're little short videos. There are a lot of other videos from other projects around the country and around the world, parents, young people, and so forth. There's videos of at least, I think, 2 of our signing ceremonies and some of the statements that our decision makers have made. And then there's pretty detailed descriptions of the process of how we find our facilitators, how we train them, et cetera. So almost everything you need to know is on the website, and call us or email us.
And just thinking about the decision makers again, and in this process, and just making sure we clarify the fact that you're not choosing anyone.
No, they're choosing us.
Right, they're choosing you.
Right.
So there's no selection.
They have to choose us.
Right. So the selection process is them.
Right.
They're,
Absolutely.
So that's another important factor, another important piece.
Yeah, I mean, we had a sign-up meeting not long ago where a parent was really excited about this, and we brought a mom brought in her son, and our project coordinators spent a lot of time talking to him, explaining to him. We have a lot of materials, by the way. I mean, we have materials that the facilitators use throughout the process that we've developed. And at the end, he said, "I don't want to do this." And the mom said, "Well, but I want you to." And the project coordinator said, "I'm sorry, this is, I hope that you'll think about this. I hope maybe you'll think about it at some other time, but you don't want to do it? No."
See, that's an important piece.
I want to say one other thing though, and that is that we are not confined to English speakers. We have a fair amount of language capability among our facilitators. And also we are not confined to people who communicate in traditional ways. So we work with nonverbal people as well.
That's another good point to kind of definitely hammer in there, that this project serves a variety of us,
And with people, I mean, we don't ask for diagnosis. We're not interested in diagnosis. We don't like the term high functioning, but I think that I can say that fairly that we are working with people with a variety of impairments of differing severity.
What a way to be inclusive.
Yeah, it's great.
That's a great.
And we learn every day from the decision makers. They are the most important part of our program, and they're the people from whom we've learned the most.
Wow. Okay. So we still have a little bit more time. If anyone has any questions, you're able to put it in the chat box, and I can read it out to Kristen, and Kristen will be able to answer it. But just touching on, how you're getting involved, the locations again.
Right. So in Rochester, the site is actually Heritage Christian Services. It's not connected to Heritage Christian Services, but the coordinator, Maureen, is there. In the capital area, it is through our partner, the New York Alliance for Inclusion and Innovation. And I believe that the coordinator there is Jennifer Ivey. The Long Island site, I'm not sure exactly where it is. I think it might be at I'm not sure where it is. So, and we have a new coordinator there whose name escapes me. I'm sorry, but it's in your information.
Right, it's in the packet.
Right, and then in New York City, we are located at the Silverman School of Social Work of Hunter, which is in East Harlem, and our coordinator there is Joan Cornacchio. So any of those coordinators will be able to chat with you. We'll be able to arrange a one-on-one meeting, and then if you do sign up, we'll be able to assign a facilitator. And again, if it's non-English speaking, hopefully we'll have a facilitator who is fluent.
That's exciting. So as we wrap up, my final question to you is there any advice or anything else you believe that our professionals and our families and our young person would need to know about supported decision-making and the SDMNY project?
Well, what you need to know about supported decision-making is that it works, that it is a less restrictive alternative to guardianship, and that it's life-changing. What I think I'd like to say to parents and to professionals as well is that guardianship has been so hardwired into this system that people have just taken for granted that it somehow will protect people with intellectual disabilities. There's no proof of that at all.
Mm-hmm.
And if you actually think about it, when moms say to me something like, well, I'm really afraid that, my 19-year-old daughter, is going to be preyed on and she'll end up pregnant. I say to her, how do you think guardianship is going to stop that, right? I mean, unless you lock her up, that piece of paper is not going to protect her.
Right.
Having a lot of people around her who she cares about and who she may consult for support in making decisions about who to see, who to go out with, what she needs to know about sex, what she should do, what she shouldn't do, is much more likely to protect her than a piece of paper. And with everything else, guardianship, there's no evidence that guardianship protects.
Right.
What guardianship does is controls. And control, I think, for parents of this generation, not people who were parents in 1969, I think parents want their children to have self-determined and inclusive lives. And that means that you can't control them any more than you can control your neurotypical kids.
Right.
So what you need to do is give them a tool that will allow them to make good and healthy decisions. And that's what supported decision-making does.
That's a great final way for us to wrap up. I want to thank Kristen for being here with us today and talking to us about this project. I hope you all had a chance to review your contact packets and stay tuned for our other presentations. Thank you.